You're sure that's muted?
Hope so.
Michael?
I can't tell until it actually brings YouTube up.
Ready?
We ready, Mike?
We are.
Working together too.
Yep, it's muted.
Thank you.
We want to welcome everyone to the Mental Health and Addiction Services Committee of the Adams Board. Let's get started. Anything we need to take care of before we jump in?
No, ma'am.
Okay, let's go through the book, starting with ACE. Is there anything you want to emphasize?
Do you want-
going with ACE?
Do you want the agenda? You may make copies of it?
I got it, but I didn't make a copy.
I don't need one.
I don't either.
This is the agenda.
I'll keep you going at least.
Okay, ACE, advocacy, choices, and empowerment. Bear with me, I haven't had my notes for very long to study. So there's been a request by the agency for $183,715, and that is what the staff has proposed the contract to be. That's an increase of $8,593 from FY 2021. Do we have any comments in regards to this? Any?
We have not given, how many years ago, Michelle? 5 years, 3 years ago, we gave them a $15,000 increase? Around there.
Yeah, I would say definitely around there someplace.
And we hadn't given them a significant increase since then. And their last request, and this request talked a little bit about workforce issues and sustainability. And I would imagine that Todd will be retiring at some point in the future and to sustain a new leader for that. It was $8,000. We're at a point where we are pretty financially doing reasonably well. And I felt like it was a pretty reasonable ask, and that is for your consideration.
And I didn't see anything out of the norm. He always fills out the whole,
Yes.
yeah. So.
And it isn't a very important service. I know if Polly was here, we would hear Polly speak about how much it did for her and how much it does for the other members. So.
And I know when we toured that, whenever that really opened even my eyes of knowing it. But when you see it and you talk to them in the house, it brings it kind of full circle back. I see nothing wrong with it.
They send their calendar, like a monthly calendar showing what their activities are and their meals and things like that. So it's pretty well organized.
Yeah, and busy.
We need to tour again.
How much did they get together last year?
Not a lot. They were very, very remote for most of the year, but they still did.
Did some meals and stuff, didn't they?
Yes. Yep. Pickup. I think many of the meals were pickup, but they also did a lot of Zoom support groups and Zoom activities, but they didn't do a lot.
I think they're starting to come back because the June calendar just came in it. So
Good.
looking at getting that in swing things.
There we go.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts or comments? And refresh my memory, we need a first and a second to recommend to the full board. Okay, what we need now is someone to make,
I'll make that motion.
yes.
I'll second.
Is
Thank you.
it just Ryan remote?
Am I the only remote one?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay. I don't feel strange at all.
Oh, we love seeing your face.
Well, we're just glad to have you here.
Okay, that's good.
Danielle, do you have any preference if we do these individually or all as one? You'd rather do all as one?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
And that's my
Oh,
fault.
really?
Okay.
That's my fault. So why don't we'll discuss and then take it.
We'll retract our emotions.
Okay.
Sorry about that. That was my fault.
Okay.
Support nothing.
Okay, let's move on. We're gonna move on to Conquest, which would be next in our book. Conquest has made a request for $43,813, which also was recommended by or proposed by staff for this year. And that is a decrease over the year 2021 of $4,687. Any comments on that?
So two of the things that Michelle and I always look at is the annualization, how much of the service is typically used over the course of the year. And knowing that last year was a very different year, this isn't from that letter, but last year was a very different year. We look at the prior 2 years to look at where were their services typically running. So this is in line, and it's a $5,000 decrease from the prior year request. So we felt reasonable we thought it was a reasonable request.
Even with the 2-year look, do you think it was skewed a lot? Like that reduction was skewed a lot because of last year, or just?
I don't think so. It was, go
It
ahead.
had to do with Medicaid, them actually pursuing
Oh.
Medicaid reimbursement. I think that had a lot of it, to do with getting the numbers down. Which
Okay.
is something we had been trying for a while, and then when the billings are coming in, like,
Does the fiscal year 21 contract amount represent the increase that we gave them mid-year,
yes, yes.
the 3,500?
Yes. Because it was 15.
Okay.
Staff is recommending.
Okay, any other thoughts, comments on Conquest?
Not from me.
Okay, let's move on to community mental health. And this is a little more convoluted.
Always.
Always.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm going to look at Natalie for this.
Yes. Okay, so the biggest point for discussion in this budget is crisis services. And I want to do a very brief review of where we've been and then a discussion of the recommendation. As everyone will recall, and I'm speaking very loud to make sure we can hear that. As everyone will recall, about 18 months ago, Cleveland Clinic began doing crisis assessment in their ED. And that reduced the amount of crisis assessment billings that CMH did because they were happening in the clinic by their staff. And we had talked a lot about that last year and how to handle, and CMH had brought on a version of a mobile crisis that went out with New Philly Police. So that kind of brings us up to date. Cleveland Clinic continues to provide crisis assessment in their ED. There are mixed feelings about it. Some people feel like it's going very well. They do the final version of the assessment over almost a Zoom process with their, what do they call them? An intake process. And that ultimately is the final decision about whether or not someone is hospitalized. And we have some law enforcement that get frustrated when they believe somebody has been released. But we have a meeting next week working on that. So that brings us up to date. CMH submitted a request this year for crisis services with, again, a very decreased amount of revenue expected from crisis assessments. You with me?
I have a question,
Yes.
because I circled that too, because so the billed services have increased significantly, yet the number of assessments decreased. How
The
does
cost
that?
has increased
Because
because the
of the
number has
decrease.
decreased.
Because of- Okay. All right.
So I believe their position is if you would like us to continue, if we are going to continue, since we are going to continue crisis services, if you want us to do that, we need this money to make us whole. So this is the specific budget issue that kept me up at night. that Michelle and I rolled around and rolled around and rolled around. And so I'm presenting this to you as an option and as a discussion point, and literally this is the best option I have in my mind. In addition to the increase last year, their request was an additional $100,000 in subsidy this year. And if you recall, there's two ways that we fund this service. One is by the service. So anytime someone is seen for a crisis service who doesn't have a benefit or Medicaid, they bill us, just like for counseling, just like for medication. But then we also pay them a subsidy, which is just money to make your program whole. So our proposal this year is different in a couple of ways. One is we are asking that instead of us giving them 1/12 of that subsidy every month, they are billing us the difference in what their cost is and what they actually brought in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then, so how will we then pay them on that? Not the 1/12. It will just be as billings come in.
They will create a spreadsheet, which we kind of did this at the end of last fiscal year, because they had come in and asked for like an additional 30,000, and we were like, okay, we're not sure you need that much, so we want to see actuals. So that happened at the very end. So it's kind of the same principle. It's going to be delayed. I mean, because when we pay the crisis claims, we're not going to be paying any subsidy until we get an invoice from them saying this is what our costs are.
Right.
That's difference number one. Instead of that 1/12 funding, which really I don't think is a great way of doing business, it's going to be that difference between the cost and the revenue. Instead of the total amount that they requested, we pared it down to 75% of that total amount. One of the things that I kept getting stuck on was that additional $100,000 over the course of 5 years is $500,000 just to sustain a service that is providing less service. And that was really hard to think about when you looked at where $500,000 could go for something else in the community. The other part of the request is that I'm asking them to develop a different business model for crisis services within 6 months, because we can't continue to financially sustain this. They can't continue to, provide a service that isn't getting many referrals. I'm not interested or asking to move crisis in any way, shape, or form, but we have to look at having it done differently. One of the other things, I talked to Jeff Neidig about this before I wrote it down and put it on paper, just to get his feedback. And one of the things that Jeff said was, Natalie, I'm a pharmacist and I have a business. And when we were going through a tough time, I don't have an Adams board that I can call and ask for funding. We have to look at how to do our business differently. So I think that's an important point, but I also know that if Paul, Rossi, and Polly were here, they have very strong feelings about supporting our local continuum of care as well. So I just want to do my best to give you a thorough picture of our board members' potential response, the community's potential response, and then I would like us to discuss this as a recommendation to take to the full board. So I'm going to be quiet.
I don't think asking someone to do business differently necessarily implies that you're going to have a negative impact on the continuum of care. We have the same thing at the bank. We have, I have the same thing in my budget, and nonprofits. Everybody has that same type of approach. You get the same money, but you have to do more with it, so you have to figure it out. So I think it is his him and his staff's responsibility to decide, on how that looks and how they approach it and what they do with it. I would be fearful of, like you said, funding that much additional money over the course of time, when it could be utilized in a much better way if we're not requiring efficiency from the people that are already receiving it. Then it seems like we're negligent, and our responsibility would be fiduciary responsible with those dollars. So, you know, I have also heard good and bad things about the mental health assessments at the ED. I've also heard good and bad things about the mental health assessments on mental health, community mental health. So I think it just is a personal preference and how people approach it and, you know, what the circumstances are. So I don't think either one could be rated based on that. Has there ever been any kind of survey done on, you know, quality of services? Do they track, you know, responses that they get at either place? You know, I'm just curious. And talk about continuum of care, you know, I'm more worried about the quality of the care versus the available, because it could be available and still not be very functional, you know, or helpful. That's a fair point. So I think that we talked about that in a board meeting at one time too, about whether there was any follow-up to show, you know, success or you know, what outcome based there are both sides.
I think it was JJ that had a survey results in his section.
Yeah, I didn't.
We're all fairly positive. I can't remember back though to think if anyone was specific to this exactly, but
I don't remember seeing crisis, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't in there. But I think that's a hard population to assess your satisfaction, but
Yeah.
it doesn't mean that you can't talk about it.
I meant, you know, even outside partners, you know, like we talked about the police and the hospital and services that would then take on people that maybe were referred somewhere else, you know, did they feel the assessment was done correctly? Did they feel that this assessment resulted in the necessary action? You know, things like that. Right? So it'd be more about not necessarily the person who received the service, but the partners then who are then impacted by the decision made about whether they get service beyond that or not. I guess that's.
where do we see this really going? Where in your magic ball do you see this panning out, the crisis side? I mean, do you see that continuing the shift to the hospital likely? What's left of it that JJ gets, CMH gets, I should say?
I wonder if their response is going to be, we choose to discontinue crisis services. It's a catch-22. I can understand that position. If their funder that they're requesting to keep them whole isn't at a point where they're willing to pay to keep them whole. From a business standpoint, that is they either can shift or they can decide to cease the service. I want us to be prepared as we make our decision that they may decide to cease providing this service.
And how did we come up with our 75%?
If we look at them not making much change that first 6 months, you with me?
Yes.
But still billing that difference between the cost and the revenue, that should be around 50% or a little bit less. And so this was an estimate for that second half of the year, knowing we're doing the first 6 months differently. That remaining 25% and any balance here with the new model should get us through the remainder of the year. It was not a science brain.
Well,
I wish it was.
Methodology behind it.
That was the methodology.
Because if I was CMH, I would come back and ask that question. If this carries through as suggested.
When you say be prepared for them to stop providing that service, what does that entail? Like for our system, for the Adams board?
Tell me what you mean by what does that entail?
As in, what steps would we need to take as an Adams board to fulfill some of the roles that come along with providing crisis service, such as pre-screening agency, health officers?
So that is the goal of having that 6 month period of time, either for them to say, we choose to discontinue or we're going to look at doing this differently. And if they choose to discontinue, there are things legally, if they're choosing to discontinue a portion of a contract, they would have to do a 120-day notice at minimum, but we would have, God willing, 6 months. Whether or not we as a board, and this is no value judgment one way or the other, whether or not we as a board would have chosen the clinic, Cleveland Clinic, to provide this service, I think that is where we are. They're going to provide it. The other option is looking at our partner agencies, which is everybody on this sheet, to see if anyone is willing to do it. I think we're going to be in the same exact position of their revenue is going to be low because people have to get medically cleared at a hospital before they can go to a site placement anyway.
And that's kind of why I asked the question prior, where do you see it going? Because if that's the process, if you have to get medically cleared anyways, that's where you gotta go. You're there, right? Why wouldn't that make the most sense in my head anyways of then there's crisis care takes place.
Now, you said Paul Rossi, who's a police officer, who he's experienced, you think he may feel differently about that. So can you tell me why you think that? Like, he's still taking people to the jail first, then they go to the hospital? Like, what?
I think,
process and testing. And Carol.
and don't let me forget to hit on the Carol issue, okay? Paul has called me twice over the past year. And it's related to some bumps that he's had when he as law enforcement has taken someone to the ED, and it wasn't the resolution that they wanted, and the person ended up walking out the door and they pass them, you know, in the squad car after they just dropped them off. That's very frustrating. I understand that. The other thing is, I'm gonna make people have to say this. Paul would much rather see local dollars go toward a local agency instead of the enterprise that is the clinic. And I gently reminded him, it's still our residents, it's still our community working there. And honestly, Cleveland Clinic never completed the contract that we gave them last year, that $20,000 contract. They did not submit a funding request for us this year. They are doing this with or without our local dollars. And they're going to keep providing the service.
And that's where I remember Paul's conversation was really hitting hard on keeping the local little.
So my concern as the Carroll County representative is, you know, that means that they have to be brought to Union Hospital, which isn't, in my understanding of my son's deputy sheriff, is not currently the practice. So explain to me how that impacts services in Carroll County as a crisis intervention.
Well, and I think that we have an opportunity here to look at how to do this differently. Not my area of expertise. I don't know the best way to provide a crisis service, but I'm wondering, could we do an 8 to 4, 8 to 5 crisis response in Carroll County? So before someone gets in the car and drives to Union, there is someone in Carroll County who is coming to where that person is, or a safe location to assess them. And if it's determined that hospitalization is necessary, then they go through the medical clearance. Carroll County is not giving the crisis response.
I know.
Yes.
What's the current practice? I'm sorry, Brian. What's the current practice? You say they're not currently coming to Union. Are they going north?
So it depends on, I just based on conversations I've had with my son, I would say I have no official idea of how they instrument, you know, internally, how the procedures outline. But it just depends on where they make the contact with the person. The county is rather large, and there are a number of options depending on which end of the county, you know, that you're at in terms of which is the closest. When you have someone in that kind of crisis situation, sometimes it's dangerous for the officer as well. Most of the time there's one officer on shift, so both the Carroll County Sheriff's Department anyway. So it's often made just based on location. So yes, sometimes they are going north, sometimes they are coming this way, sometimes they're going to East Liverpool. Sometimes they're going as far as Youngstown because they're on the end of the county. And this is just geographically a very large Very Sims wants to do, Bill.
And it would be what, police, some assigned, individuals that we've signed off on that would give that initial assessment. Who has the ability in Carroll County to give those assessments?
CMH has health officers, and that's what we approve at our
That's
board
what
meetings. Yeah.
I was looking for.
And when I was saying the procedure, I meant at that Philly hospital.
Mhm.
I mean, I think right now they're probably using the health officers. In fact, I know they're using the health officers. So this is my concern, just in terms of, we think about it as a service in Tuscarawas County, but we serve 2 counties, and demographically, they're very different in the fact that one doesn't have a 24-hour medical center. There's not even a stack here.
Mhm.
It's open
So
24
Carroll
hours.
County is currently using CMH solely for crisis.
Yes, as far as I understand.
Or they're driving them to a hospital, an ED and bypassing.
And in those circumstances, then it's the hospital that's doing the assessment and they are basically submitting to their funding source and that's not involving us. Is that correct?
Correct.
So if we would go down the path of our recommendation, would we put a task group together or something to try to better handle how we address Carroll? I mean,
Here's how it's playing out in my mind. Doesn't mean this is the right way. I thought a lot about this and diving into crisis models. And the state of Ohio has done a really good job the past 2 years of doing trainings on this. But at the end of the day, we're a funder. If CMH chooses to remodel their crisis service and they want us to be a part of it, absolutely. 8 days a week, we will get a team and we will sit down and do anything we can to support the change. If CMH says we cannot do it without this amount of subsidy, then we pull together a team of local partners, potentially CMH as well, and we look at how this is going to look across Tuscany. Those are the 2 tracks that we're kind of waiting on. And we'll work it out either way. We'll work it out. We're not the only rural community that has a multi-county area and has to meet crisis needs. We'll do it.
So our decision today is about, do we follow the recommendation, yes or no? And then supposedly CMH is being asked to come up with an alternative proposal. And then is it Brian, you're right on the edge of my vision there, who's raising the question about where does this go in the long run? Do we know what these other rural counties tend to do? Is there alternatives to what we currently have that other counties may already be using that we might draw from?
There are, Ryan, and that's something that we're going to need to dive into when we decide which direction CMH is going to go. And every time that we've been made aware of these crisis trainings, I make sure that I share it with them. They have some specific rural crisis trainings that they've offered. So there is information out there for them to pull from related specifically to rural communities that I think would help to direct them. If they choose not to, it will help direct us. I can't speak well enough to it today, though, to tell you what I think is the best option.
Okay.
Hopefully I won't. Hopefully, we'll be fine, man.
So what would be the negative impact if Cleveland Clinic took it over?
Like Heather said, there's pros and cons depending on who's done the crisis assessment. I think that fundamentally we would be discontinuing a local service in a local agency. As long as we can figure out an alternative for Carroll County, I think that's going to be an issue, making sure that our residents don't have to drive all the way to Union to get an assessment.
But the bottom line is we want the best for the client.
Correct.
Whoever provides that.
Correct.
And under the current model of continuing to fund CMH through this at an elevated rate that, I won't say it's throwing money away, but it's not as efficient as it could be with the fund. Right?
I think they would agree with that too. I mean, they're trying to figure out a way to make it work, and it's a very costly ask of the board, and I just don't see us being able to continue. Ryan, I guess I'm really curious as a clinician, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, having worked in some crisis services in the past, there's several different models that I've seen. One is, of course, the emergency room model where they bring people in and there's usually either somebody, depending on the size of the emergency room, there's somebody there all the time, or there's somebody on call, okay? And I've served in that function myself before. You can also have sort of a crisis service that's in a local facility, okay? This is a non-emergency room, and these people can function using both phone crisis as well as in-person crisis. And I've also worked in those kinds of facilities. That kind of facility tends to serve as more of a triage. It's more cost effective than the emergency room model. And what that does is it helps manage all of those crises that do not need escalated to potential inpatient care. Okay, so that's kind of more cost effective to do it that way. Then you have, as I understand, this kind of mobile crisis, which I am not familiar with, where you've got people sort of going to the crisis area in some situations. And that to me sounds like a very high cost way of doing things, because you got to have that person available. Unless you're in a situation where that occurs only very infrequently, and you always have sort of a rotating call system where you draw from an established facility, like CMH's crisis stabilization unit. So, but that is kind of outside my administrative experience, how you would set that kind of system up. So am I answering your question, Natalie?
I guess more specifically, how do you, as a clinician and as someone who's running a clinical business, what are your thoughts about this proposal?
Well, I think the funding the difference between cost and revenue is definitely a much better than handing them a pre-established amount of money as far as kind of running a clinical business, if that's what you're asking me. Aside from that, Natalie, can you be more specific? I'm not quite sure what you're asking me.
Well, I think you hit one part. The other part was that 75% of the cost, the request for them to give us a new proposal for the program within 6 months.
Yeah, well, and here's where you're getting back to what you and Jeff were talking about. You know, and I face the same sort of challenge. You know, my practice does not get any subsidies, and we were looking at back when the pandemic hit. Okay, what do we do to survive? You know, all of our clients started canceling, and we had to adapt. So there is the situation where CMH would look at this and say, okay, the model that they are currently using, as you're pointing out, is higher cost per patient because their scale is being drawn off to the emergency room. And so they are going to have to either learn from some of those other places that are out there, or decide that it's not viable for them to provide that sort of ongoing mobile and or other type of crisis service. So, and I'm not sure of the numbers of people that they're serving. You know, at some point it becomes not feasible to have a separate crisis service for a dwindling number of people who need it. And at that point, even though the hassle factor is significantly greater in each case, like for example, those folks in Carroll County who might be being transported to some distant emergency room. That is an extreme, it's a higher cost and a higher hassle for each individual person. But if our numbers are dwindling to the point that we can't support a separate service, then that becomes sort of the best global answer to this kind of situation. That's just my surface read on that.
That's what I was looking for.
Okay.
And I think with your explanation of the 75%, where you come up with that, it makes sense. You know, it covers what we believe needs covered in the interim. It allows us some extra to prepare for what may happen. I'm narrowing my decision down to your proposal.
Can you just tell me who's in charge of the services that oversees that?
So Jessica Kinsey is Director of Social Work. There is also a connection between who's doing our crisis assessment and the new director of the Behavioral Health Center. Yeah.
I can tell you who that is. I figured there was something. Thank you.
So bottom line, explain this again to me.
The proposal.
Yes.
And again, this is a portion. There's many other services that they provide. So, tell me if I'm getting in too much.
Let me,
Yes.
from experience, I had Joe at the emergency room. It took hours to get a response person there from CMH. Hours. Well, he stuck around. There's going to be a lot that don't stick around. They're gonna run. He did stick around. We were there 10 hours total before the assessment was done and a decision was made what to do with him. I felt that was a slow process, inefficient. And that just can't be the case. If that's still going on. Maybe they have more response team now, maybe things are shortened, maybe, but that just was, when you're in that crisis.
And I don't want to speak for Carroll County because I don't, and it doesn't sound like it's the same by any means. But I mean, you have one law enforcement person saying local, local, local. You also have other law enforcement folk saying, I'm so thankful that Union is doing this now because the process is so much smoother and faster and transition is better and it's not the continuous waiting.
And ultimately, that's what we want.
I mean,
What's needed.
correct. I mean, you have to look at what's best for the patient, so.
I'd be curious to know what their experiences are in Carroll County. I know the health officer is utilized for triage, just as he meant, as Ryan mentioned. A lot of times it saves the department a lot of time in taking somebody to the hospital that isn't going to be admitted or sent on anyway.
Correct.
So I guess what I'm saying is knowing the model of staffing at the Carroll County Sheriff's Department, sometimes when that happens, other things, other services that need to be provided by police officers are then not able to be provided because they're taking unnecessary trips to an emergency room where a health officer could triage that person. I know this specifically in 2 cases involving my son, and then you're not responsive to other calls that are also equally an emergency. And that's partly the department's issue to handle and manage. But when there's not a triage person, it does create challenges. Now, I'm not saying the health officer is always the most responsive and that works out that way. And that's what I would like to understand better from CMH a little bit more about how their model is applied. What is the rate of response? You know, how are they being utilized? What's the rate of utilization in each county? What's the process that they interface with their partners? You know, for example, do people at the jails or at the on the departments know regularly how to contact, you know, who the health officer is? Is that is that an easy call to make, you know, and is it, like you said, is it efficient? You know, I don't know those questions. I just know in personal experiences, there have been instances where that has made it so they haven't had to make unnecessary lengthy trips to a facility that, you know, is sometimes an hour away from what they're currently located. So I don't know the quick answer to all that, and I guess that's what we're saying. CMA just come back with us with some model, and I'd like to see some past numbers, you know, to really get us a good idea of how they interface with their partners too. You know, who are those people that are using the health officers? How is it working? Do you have surveys to prove satisfaction? You know, are they happy with the service? Are they not? What are they doing instead if they're not happy? You know, like those are, you know, those are the things that I can't really answer in all respects, but I think just like she said, there's some who are, some who aren't, and depends on what shift you're working, depends on lots of variables, you know.
So what I'm hearing you say is if community mental health care decides to revamp and remodel their service, part of what we would ask for from that is kind of a as is or current status survey to get some feedback from our partners to help direct their decision.
Yeah, I feel like that your stakeholders should always direct your decisions in terms of how you provide service. So I think if they don't have that information, it's gonna be really difficult to make a decision about an efficient and effective model. So yes, that's what I'm saying.
And finances might override all that,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, and if they say no, they're not gonna invest in that, that's fine. But I think those are things that if we have any responsibility to provide a continuum of care alternative, then those are the things that I would want to explore. You know, even if it's just panel discussions, just to say, what has your experience been and how do you wish it looked like? You know, what would make this easier? You know, I mean, just because they want something doesn't mean they're always gonna get it, but it's always good to know what you're striving towards, maybe in 3 to 5 years too, you know?
Well, and I hate saying this because I don't want it to sound like an excuse, but we had intended to take a much deeper dive into crisis services prior to working from home for a year. It's time. It's timely. This is happening for a reason. It's time for us to do this.
I mean, happy to be part of some of those things we've done in data.
Let's say that.
No, I love that.
Okay, good.
So I should be careful, huh?
Do you want me to go over a few other items on their budget?
Yes.
Or are there any other questions about this proposal? Are there any changes that you want me to make, or are you okay with this going to the board as it is? I mean, regarding that proposal
For just crisis.
for just crisis.
I'm good.
Okay. As we had discussed, you know, CMH made a request for AOD, and some of these, the reason I'm hesitating is because we looked at annualized figures when we looked at our proposed contract. So it looks like we gave them significantly less than they requested. But again, knowing that if we earmark this money for this agency and it's not spent, then that money can't be spent toward anything else. We always, and I know Daniel cringes when I say this, but we always have the option mid-year to do budget amendments.
Mid-year.
To do budget amendments if for some reason what we decide to allocate isn't getting them through. And we've done that. We did that last year. I know it's a lot, but and mental health again, we're about $100,000 less. And Michelle, remind me, I didn't look at my notes. What did was that?
That we remove?
It was TBS and, no, you're looking at me.
No, I am on my work paper, my work budget.
If you go grab that, I'll
I
talk
know,
about
yeah,
some of the
I
other ones.
almost brought them in with me because I'm like, someone's gonna want that.
The crisis stabilization unit, every year we've given them an increase. Their request was for $15,000 more. That's one more of those 1/12 every month. So we wanted to keep that at a minimal increase. Hotline was just $500 increase. Forensic is a state allocation. The navigator, if you recall, that is the individual who directs, how do I want to say this? Her job is to keep in contact with a lot of our adults with a severe mental illness in the community. If they get hospitalized, to be our conduit to the local hospital. If they step down, to make sure they have their treatment services set up. If they go to a group home, to make sure that transition happens smoothly. My position and the position that the board took up over the past couple of years is there are portions of this that are Medicaid billable. So I continue to offer between 55 and 58, and they continue to come in at a higher request. And I have a feeling that's just something we'll keep going back and forth with. School groups, we gave them for 12 last year, we offered 15 this year. The crisis stabilization unit, that is funding that comes in and goes directly out to them.
What are the school groups that, tell me, what does that consist of?
So community mental health care works primarily in Carroll County schools, while Guidestone works really primarily in Tusk County schools for whatever reason. They do support groups, they do coping groups, they do prevention groups, just very clinical use building programming.
Okay, that's why I questioned that, because I thought we had that with guys.
Yes, you're correct. The last item was something that I asked them to put in. We, for a long time, have not had a clinician leading our survivors of suicide group. It has been a survivor, Christy Wilkin, and you see her name on our billings. And I talked to Christy recently, and my proposal is that we have a clinician begin to lead that survivors of suicide group. And Christy will lead an aftercare portion. So once they've gone through that really difficult work of coping, if they want to continue to stay involved for that support and that camaraderie, then they would continue on with Christy's group. She does a lot of activities. She also does the suicide prevention walk, which brings in a significant amount of money. So I asked Community Mental Health Care to budget for a licensed clinician to provide that service.
How many hours roughly is that? Just gives us how much service.
Yeah,
will they
that's,
get for
I
that?
was questioning that too.
So it is, I told him to estimate between 2 to 3 hours a month, plus planning, plus paperwork, plus some involvement in the coalition activities. So that's at minimum 1 group a month plus supported work.
Are they billing for that service then? Will they'll bill the client?
No, they're billing us. They're not opening a chart.
Okay, that was my
Yeah,
question.
yeah, good question.
This is
So
both
with-
counties.
So that wouldn't be just the group night when we all meet. Would they be available, say, 3 nights later, somebody's in crisis? Or
I will make sure, I didn't specify that, but I will make sure that I discuss that with them and include something. You know, we are in such a workforce issue that I don't want to scare somebody off by saying at 2 a.m. if someone has a crisis, will you still answer your phone? But I would want them to call crisis services and then alert that person the next workday.
Yeah, that's it. When that becomes a hotline or mental health crisis, I mean, they're already providing in another fashion. They just need to know what the steps are, you know. I think that group does a nice job of informing people what to do if they get situations.
Christy was answering those calls, and that's one of the reasons I think she's getting very burnt.
That's a lot.
Out. Yeah.
well, and not being a clinician, I think there's things that are missing that need addressed. This is very much needed. I attend the support group, and it is a definite need and has been.
I'm just asking if it's enough. That's why I'm asking how much time we're asking for
Yeah.
payment. Because based on the amount that I'm assuming they're billing per hour, this doesn't seem like a lot of billable hours for a year. Does that make sense? Brian, would you agree?
Yes. It looks like this is just this is what, a monthly meeting or twice a month? This,
Yes. But then you're asking them to be available for some additional thing, paperwork, activities. I mean, it adds up quickly, and based on the rate, I would think this.
I mean, if I figured it right, it's $583 a month.
Yeah.
For
So you're maybe
what,
getting
a
5
couple
hours.
hours of a meeting.
Mhm.
That's pretty high rate.
But there's paperwork and such you said afterwards. That's right.
so if she's not opening a chart, what kind of paperwork are we talking about?
So what Christy does, and I don't want this level of detail, but she'll provide some level of summary to us as a funder. We also have a very blooming, it is in the process of blooming Suicide Prevention Coalition, which I would hope this person would be a part of as well, which meets monthly. And honestly, a clinician, and you know this, Ryan, a clinician's hourly rate is around $100, depending on their level of licensure. So it's not, I don't think it's that far off. So I'm hearing, I feel like I'm hearing someone say it seems low, and then some say it seems high.
I guess I was understanding that there was paperwork. I was thinking there was 5 to 7 hours of time.
Oh,
So I was misunderstanding.
yeah, I don't think it's that much.
So,
I mean,
well, if you're taking the calls at night and stuff, it might be.
if you want to offer them more than they
No,
ask for.
I was just curious what the estimation for time is.
Well, that's what he came in with, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
I'd be fine starting with that from that perspective. It's
Yeah.
not like we put a number, right? So.
Yeah, I'm sure the clinician is not going to take home $583 a month for doing this.
Correct.
The agency's keeping a pretty good chunk of that.
Yeah, I would agree probably for administrative purposes.
Well, and this might not even become a new client, or, I mean, this just might be someone wants to attend a support group. There needs to be professional leadership at that group.
Right.
That's all I'm saying, and that's all I'm looking at. I don't even know that there needs to be paperwork. I mean, her job may entitle that, but, you know, someone just needs to be there to lead this group in a professional manner, which has been lacking, my opinion, along with numbers.
That is why the request was made. Yeah. Yep. It's time. We definitely need to.
What makes logical sense that you have people that have had those situations that someone else would see red flags, would know things, someone trained in that area would certainly be better. And the responsibility to ask someone who's a non-clinician to take on that if something were to go wrong. So not something I personally would want that responsibility. Someone untrained in that. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, I don't want that responsibility. So I mean, just the fact that she's done it, you know, is honorable, but at the same time, it's a lot to ask of someone who's not. Yeah, so I agree that it's needed. I just wanted to understand the hours.
Yeah. That's wonderful. And what's the coalition? That's another step.
You know, we have a tremendous anti-drug coalition. We have a really tremendous drug addiction task force. A decade ago, we had a very good suicide prevention coalition, and then the opiate epidemic hit, and it was all hands on deck to address that. And our suicide coalition just kind of fell by the wayside, and that has to get more attention than it's had. And the last item on community mental health care is that ambulance. And as you'll remember, that was over $100,000 a couple years ago. The reason it's decreased is when Smith Ambulance transports from Cleveland Clinic, when Cleveland Clinic calls to say this person needs to go to a hospital, they don't bill us. And so that is why we've gone from over $100,000 down to, we're making a proposal of 40,000 for this year, and it was, and we're at 19.
So is Smith still transporting?
Correct.
If Union calls them, they'll bill Medicaid and not us.
Well, I don't know that they're billing Medicaid if Union calls them. They might be doing it through their contract if the person, I don't know how it's happening. All I can tell you is if the call is coming from the clinic, we are not getting billed. I know, Dana. And so that's a summary of CMH's proposal.
So where do we stand with this? What are we gonna recommend to the full board?
My personal opinion is I'm good with the proposal from staff. And then I think if that is what is decided as a whole, through our group up and through the board, that just needs to include, I think, then some action on addressing Carol.
I think we just have to be prepared for the idea that we may just discontinue, which I think is highly likely.
Yep.
So, I guess that's what I'm saying is that, you know, it's probably very likely in my estimation, I would imagine so, just from a business standpoint. So I think we just have to have our ducks in a row and know what we're gonna do next, because it might not be the 6 month period. that we need.
But if I heard you right, though, he has to give, or
120
CMH has to
days.
give 120
So you have
days.
3 months or 4 months.
Well, at minimum, we will funnel them through the existing crisis provider at the clinic, if that is what happens while we're building a new system, because otherwise that would be horrible for our community and our goal that are happen. We'll cross that bridge if that's what happens. The other option is give them the request. Which I don't think feels very good.
I think there's a lot of unknown questions that we talked about in terms of quality, responsiveness, things of that nature that haven't been answered. So,
Okay, so we're gonna go with the staff proposed contract. Anything else with CMH needs addressed or? Okay, let's move on to NAMI.
If you made it through item 3 on our agenda, everything is smooth sailing from here, Mary Ann.
For your
I feel like I need to fan myself.
And thank you for not putting it first and not putting it last.
Our attention span's better that way, yeah.
NAMI is facilitated by mostly ACE, but there is also Candy from Ryan's office that is an important part of that group as well. They have asked for $10,000 over the course of the past couple years. They continue to do work despite the pandemic, although it's obviously significantly decreased. And our recommendation is another $10,000.
Easy by me.
Okay, that was easy.
Yeah, like I said, we went through the most difficult discussion.
Okay, let's go to Ohio Guide Stoughton.
Do you want to do Noah's Hope?
Okay, let's do Noah's Hope.
I'm sorry.
It's under auxiliary.
Yeah, it's.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's why you said that.
It is, but that's line something.
I'm just gonna be
line
quiet.
84 on your worksheet.
No, it's weird the numbers in there.
I know.
That's okay.
Again, very minimal discussion. We have given $35,000 over the course of the last couple of years. I had made a statement when the previous director was still there that we were going to kind of cap at 35 until other partners were increasing their contribution, because the board has by far the biggest contribution. And they've been able to maintain their budget with that request. And they are, if you read their narrative, both the Child Advocacy Center and Guidestone are expecting a significant decrease in their VOCA grant funding. It's affecting both of their budgets, including potentially the CAC going to part-time staff. They're working through how to manage that. But I do want you to know that we are awarding what they asked for, but they also are experiencing a funding deficit.
Okay, so everybody's on board with the requested amount of 35,000. All right, sounds good.
I'm concerned about the vote.
Yeah.
Okay, now on to Ohio Guidestone. I'll turn this back over to you.
Thank you. Speaking of the VOCA grant, Guidestone included a request for $25,000 for each of their Tusk and Carroll DV shelters for a total of $50,000 to sustain them because of the VOCA decrease. We did put that in the grant request. We did put that in the proposal. But we are going to continue to monitor whether or not they get additional funding, or if VOCA is increased to its original amount. So that $50,000 is in the proposal, but it's going to be dependent on how this kind of unrolls through the year and any additional funding they get specifically for the DV shelters. Does that make sense?
So you don't necessarily see the need for this to go up, it will go down.
Correct.
Yeah, I know they're exploring other options. I know the care funding is currently closed.
Correct, because of staffing.
That's been coming for a while, and they've been posting staffing issues for probably over a year and unable to fill a position. So I think the problem that I understand, that I have personal experience that's dealing with this right now, is that VOCA, or even the alternative funding, is often based on numbers, and when you have to close a shelter, then you can't provide the data that's necessary to request the grant funds, then to further the initiatives of the shelter. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is spent. I guess is what I'm saying. And
Well, and I believe, and I
well
can't
spent.
remember the exact origin of VOCA funds, but it is related to, you don't know,
The victims of crime assistance, it comes from the Attorney General's office.
based on courts.
So the victims assistance applies for grants that are just awarded based on victim assistance needs and what the different agencies and different, like attorneys sometimes is awarded to domestic violence shelters, depending on whether people are reporting that to victim assistance, and that's how a lot of the funding is through that.
But the origination of the fund, and I can't remember specifically what court cases it's related to,
Yeah,
but these funding pots, and I imagine we're gonna see this maybe in other areas, these funding pots are built based on findings in courts or judgments in courts. And since our court has been shut down or reduced,
Yes.
the amount of money available through these grants is also.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was trying to.
Yeah,
indicate, but
yeah.
not in a-
We
the
got
best
it.
way, so sorry.
So we are recommending that $50,000 to continue to be monitored, because I have a hard time with the governor really having that much support for behavioral health, also not supporting a financial gap for DV shelters. So I want to take a wait and see attitude with that. I can't imagine that would happen.
I think there are some, I can't say the word advocacy without like messing it up.
You just
but-
did.
But I think there's some groups that are lobbying for this to be not the case, so And I think some of them are giving some pretty loud voices.
Do you think if the VOCA grant doesn't come back, that Carol the Carol shelters will not come back as well? I mean, is that gonna affect them from at that level?
I think just having a pool of people to choose from for staffing is always an issue in smaller communities. So it's not one side, it's not one problem. There's multiple issues creating the challenges in Carroll County, and sometimes they don't pay very much. So I will be honest with you, it's like, $10 to $12 an hour. It's not much to ask of someone, or not very much when you're asking somebody to deal with these kinds of situations, a number of cases. So I think right now people are making more money doing other things, including staying home. So, so we'll see what happens when the landscape changes in terms of people available to work. But I know it was an ongoing problem prior to COVID, and it got much worse during COVID. But personally, I would really hate to see the shelter stay permanently closed. They worked really hard to get one in Carroll County, and it would be a really shame. So I know Pam's going to do her best to make sure that doesn't happen. It would be a shame if the vocal funding isn't available. In many ways, because that vocal funding affects all kinds of layers related to victims of crime, so not just this particular organization, but over the whole state. So, very well said.
And I'm just hitting some of the bullet points on my memo. Because of an increase in Medicaid reimbursement or Medicaid expansion, Guidestone is not requesting room and board dollars for their women's residential. That 123 is a women's grant that has for 20 years, 30 years, gone directly forever from the state to them to provide that room and board service. We did ask them. I don't really have any, I do not believe our men's residential facility will be opened this calendar year. This fiscal year, maybe. But I did ask Pam to include a little bit of money in the budget to help start up and bridge that funding gap in the beginning between having staff and opening the doors and getting people to fill the beds. So she projected $20,000 as a startup cost, but I don't know that we will be able to do all of the steps we need to do to have bodies in there within the next 12 months. And they're maybe hanging there, Marion. We're closer than we've been.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's way better than before, right?
Closer than we've been.
I had a question.
Yes.
Sorry, about the request for Help Me Grow. She seemed to ask for a significant amount more, but we offer the same. Can you explain the rationale? for
I
that?
can, and that is one of the ones that you all may feel we approach this differently. In many places across the state, Help Me Grow is either provided by the county health department or the board of DD. Because in many cases, the medically fragile or the youth with a developmental disability are who are referred to the Help Me Grow program. Because of that, I believe she requested $30,000. So because of that, and I've shared this with Pam when she began to make this request, I certainly will ask the board to put some funding toward this for the children who have some type of a behavioral health issue from 0 to 3. But knowing that this isn't our primary population that we serve, I feel that it's not fair or appropriate to ask us to cover that total cost, which is why I put it at $10,000.
Your rationale, sorry.
Okay.
Because I know in Carroll County, the board of
Correct.
And we will be carrying over probably that 10,000 because they haven't even touched it this fiscal year.
So I think it's because right now is the majority of the people fall in those other two buckets. So.
Yeah, so they haven't go down the early intervention funding that they get from them for the services that this 10,000 would cover if they exceeded. So 30,000 would have been way too.
That makes sense.
Thank you.
Again, school consultation, we bumped that up to 15. I think that that's always money well spent. And that matches what we are giving CMH for their school groups as well.
I had a question on line item 48 with AOD to be determined on the source of funding.
Go ahead.
Are those two gas?
Look at our allocations, the preliminary allocations, and there are several funding lines that did not have anything in them at this point. So, ATP was one of them, so that's why it's in there as a TBD, because anything that's not on that list will have a TBD in here.
That's a quick summary of Guidestone. Is there any other, they have a lot of grants, as you can see, the AOD SOAR and the RSP grants. So there's a lot of loose ends, but that's nothing that we would vote on. That is.
All the vacancies, what can be done to address them? You know, this kind of scared me when it said they had to leave the shelter unattended at times. That, I can't imagine doing that.
It's a pay issue, but I didn't.
Well, here's what I can tell you, a couple of things. This is an issue across the state. This is an issue across businesses. It is a crisis in the behavioral health field for a couple of reasons. The pay being one thing, they can earn more money through July, is it? When their unemployment stays high, at that elevated rate. People are not coming into our field as they were in the past.
Didn't you talk with the dean about, and where are we with that?
I thought I emailed that. Did I not email that?
Oh, you might have.
The
Yes, you did.
social service. Yeah.
LSW, if they're having.
So that the good news is in fall of
22.
2022,
Yeah.
Kent State branches are going to have an LSW program. The bad news is we are 5 years away from graduating our first
class.
LSW class. Long term, it's going to be great for our community. Short term, it doesn't address our workforce issues. I can tell you, we had a meeting with our board association and the state MHAS, and we've been discussing this for months and hitting this hard, and they're aware of the workforce issue. They're forming a task force, which I think is late. I mean, it's really too late. But when you look at what's happened in, Tuscarawas County alone over the past 3 or 4 years, maybe 5 years, Cleveland Clinic developed a behavioral health center. Brightview opened their doors. I'm missing one. Jody's prevention programming has expanded significantly. Conquest grew in Carroll County. So not only have we had new agencies come in, managed care is now hiring people at a much higher rate to be able to do case coordination for high-risk high-need people. There's a new program coming for high-risk high-need kids that's going to steal more of our staff. Schools are hiring counselors. So behavioral health has been grabbed onto philosophically across the state, and they're doing wonderful things. The workforce has just not kept up, and our local community provider agencies offer a much lower rate of pay, and therefore we lose our clinicians. It's an awful situation.
And it's not just clinicians either, right? I mean,
No, it's just
all the way
all
up.
workers.
Oh,
Yeah,
correct.
yes.
You want a second job, Ryan?
I got all the work I want, thanks.
Just asking.
No hesitation there.
We're having the same problem. We're trying to hire people as well.
Yeah.
It's been
I
a,
wondered if the private practice was having that same experience.
oh yes,
Well,
absolutely.
it's difficult to compete with benefits related to other things that are larger agencies or even state organizations. I mean, it's nearly impossible. I mean, if all of us sitting at this table were to give options, you think about what you would choose, it's hard, so.
We talk about parity, and behavioral health is like physical health. And if you have a wound, you see a doctor. If you have an emotional wound, you see a doctor. However, our treatment of the people that do the work is so vastly different. And not that I think we should be making what physicians make, but maybe a portion of what nurses make. I mean, they don't make a bad,
Yeah.
they don't make a bad salary.
I
Yeah, we treat it ourselves so differently. But any other questions about Guidestone?
So we're good. Everybody's good with the contract amount for guidance.
I don't.
I think that we'll take that to the full board, based on what the committee said. I just want to make sure.
So Southeast, you saw just completed their trial process through our billing system. They just started to get their claims in. We believe it's back through September. We think they're up to date. We don't know if they're up to date.
I don't think they were, I don't think they're that close to being current, or they were smaller numbers.
Well, I don't think the volume's there. They are not enrolling a tremendous amount of clients in any way. Not many at all. Surprisingly small number, actually.
But this is, the first year we knew that they didn't have numbers. The second year, we continued to offer them because we wanted to make sure that they had funding available to support the individuals. And they still didn't get the claims run through, so we had no benchmark. This year, we stopped everything until they had the process through. And based on what Danielle is seeing and knowing that they're not potentially up to date, it's still not near $32,000, correct? A couple thousand, 7, I think, is that the last number?
Wasn't it 4?
Well, they billed 7,000, but 4,000 was paid. Some of that'll come back through. There's a couple errors, but I mean, based on the sliding scale and so forth. And I would imagine that would increase in the next year, honestly, because I mean, they may not be advertising because they don't know if they're getting reimbursed. Individuals may not know they have a non-Medicaid contract now. I mean, they've been traditional Medicaid for quite some time. I don't know, for some of the other agencies, the Medicare population ends up coming into our non-Medicaid contract because of the same issue, because of lack of providers. They may be eating all of their costs associated with Medicare clients versus sending them our way like other agencies are.
They have a new director, don't they, in the last year or two?
Beth Powell retired and Leslie Warner is their clinical director. And then they have Columbus Southeast, that is their mothership.
I don't know if they're struggling as much as the other two agencies is with regard to workforce, though. I mean,
Yeah,
they're a bigger
staff.
they're a bigger organization. I'm assuming they probably do pay more, just because they're all over the state.
Yeah.
So they have the credentials though to bill a lot more to Medicare than the other agencies.
So I wanted to give you an update about Southeast. By the time we have our June board meeting, that'll give them another couple weeks to submit any additional bills, and maybe we can, not maybe, and we will have a better number to put in here for our proposed contract for them. So I guess that I would ask if the committee is ready to approve 1 through 6, and we will hold Southeast for the full board. Any concerns or questions about that stuff?
So where am I missing? Oh, no, it's Hope. We have gotcha. We did that. So you're asking us to go with the 6.
On your agenda, 1 through 6.
Yes, okay. All right, so we're at the process. Do we need to go back through to clarify where we are with each of these agencies, or did we clear that up during our discussion? Any questions? Okay. We're good. All right. So we want to take to the full board a recommendation for ACE. Add their requested amount as well as our staff recommendation of $183,715. Was that a motion I just made?
So, go ahead, Brad.
I think she wants it wrapped into all 6 of them, everything but southeast.
Not individually now. Okay.
So make a motion that we accept all 6 that we've discussed at the rate agreed upon in the proposed contract rate.
I would second that.
Now you do all
All in favor?
of it?
Aye.
Thank you.
That's everybody.
That was easy. I was trying to make it too hard.
The last item on our agenda, item C, is agency and auxiliary budget recommendations, which is the second sheet, the orange section. I can go over these in depth. Again, what Michelle and I do, this is really the easiest part of our budget thing. We sit down with what we've spent through the course of the year, and then we look at what have we not done that we want to do, and do we have the money to do it for next year? One of the things that you'll see an increase in is the technology infrastructure. We are talking about getting a smart board for our wall, so that we can do some of this work on a board so that everybody in the boardroom can see what we're working on. And so that was, we got some quotes for that, and so that was an additional around either I think it was around $7,000 at the end of it. Michelle, am I missing anything?
Does that include a new Gosh server?
I think you put part of the Gosh server in
In there
there,
too?
and then we also have the reserves, the equipment reserves that can be used towards the Gosh server as well.
Thanks.
And then medications drop. Line 81.
Everything, there's a lot of Medicaid coverage, so the expenses aren't as great. And basically, well, another thing is the city health department, they usually get their own medications too, through Medicaid. But they haven't been providing any services because they might have 2 people a month. It's been really, the jail being, I'm kind of locked down, but normally, but also extra lockdown. There aren't as many people going there. Now, the jail will give shots sometimes, and so that would be included in that pot right there. But when they give the pills, it's so much cheaper that we just didn't have expenses.
I got my food check this.
You did not pay for that.
They probably didn't.
I mean, we kind of all did, just not.
Is that because you were afraid of the health department after they swabbed you?
County Health.
Yeah.
Well, when I could feel my eye again, it was that hot. No, they just called me first. I signed up with it.
Well, the health department never called me back, the county. never called me back.
Well, I
And
called them back and said, cancel me.
I called the city and said, hey, my sister just told me she's positive, and they're like, oh, well, you can get a shot. So they said I got a shot for 4 weeks after my shingle shot. No, 2 weeks. I'm like, okay, she goes, how about I come in Tuesday? I'll be in there.
Perfect.
The only other really out of the ordinary item is Family and Children First Council. That is 85. So we provide funding, just a contribution to both Tusk Council and Carroll Council. And for years, we've also partnered on some placement of kids. So when they go, depending on the job, and their benefits, but if they go to residential treatment and it's not something that there's another funding source for, The councils will come to the major partners, Job and Family Services, Board of DD, Adams Board. And they'll ask if we'll do a three-way funding agreement for this child. Happens at a much lower rate in Carroll than it does in Tusk, just because the number of children. And Carroll also, council also has a much larger reserve than Tusk does. Tusk does not have a much of a reserve. So what happens now is Veronica will come to me and she will plead a case for a child who needs placement. And I will fire about 15 questions back at her. And then she has to go and ask, and it's just not a good system. I don't want to be responsible for deciding when Veronica knows the case intricately and Paige, the council staff member, knows the case intricately, about whether or not I trust putting board funding toward this. I trust them. So what in Tusk County, what DD, JFS, and the Adams Board are looking to do this year with your approval is put money into a shared pot of funding, based on what we can put in. My amount's probably going to be lower than what Job and Family Services or DD would put in. And then we entrust council staff and the committee that they work in to use that money responsibly to support children in the services that they need.
I think that's how Carroll County built some of their reserves.
They did. And Tusk had good reserves and it wasn't spent. And what I understand is the council decided about 20 years ago, why are we putting money in this pot when nobody's using it? And it dwindled and dwindled and dwindled.
I think this is a good model system.
So
For the work that they're doing, they need to be able to depend on things.
So that's different from how we've done it in the past, and that's why you see that increase so much. And I'll take any other questions from Michelle.
Everything lined up so matched so much. I don't have any questions.
Yeah, that's the one thing about auxiliary, we're not disputing it.
Yeah.
Or debating on whether we can put it there, but this is what it is.
None back.
So when you're ready, if there's no questions, we can get a motion.
Okay, so we need a motion on the auxiliary funding.
Make a motion that we accept the auxiliary funding as proposed for fiscal year 2020.
Is it the 915 or the 912?
912.
I'll second the motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passed. Okay, what further do we need to, is that it?
Not a thing. The board operations goes through budgets.
Okay.
So at the next board meeting, this will go through budget with our recommendations out. They'll ask a couple of questions, they'll likely move forward, take it to the full board for.
So we have a budget meeting next week, Daniel? Yeah, because we have a budget meeting next week. Because what we don't want to have happen is the budget committee to have some question or concern, and then we delay approving the contract at our June board meeting. So our hope is that we iron out any issues. We can revisit it again at our June budget committee meeting and then our June board meeting. And then God willing, we have a finalized budget.
So you'll take this to the budget committee.
So Michelle and I will take this and say, this is what was approved by Mental Health and Addiction Services. And then Michelle does a really beautiful separate sheet that looks at every funding source and how our funding sources that we know of connect to this money so that they can see there's enough money to support what we're proposing. And then they hopefully do the thing match and then it goes to the board.
Anything else regarding that? Any unfinished business?
Not for me.
New business?
Not for me.
Meeting adjourned.
Nice seeing you, Ryan.
I
Take
know
care.
this was a long meeting.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Ryan.
Shorter than I
Right.
anticipated. I'm happy.
Good to see you.
Shorter than I anticipated.
Will someone admit me to the Zoom?
Um,
Who was that?
Jeff,
Yeah, I wonder where he
he's in the
was.
waiting room.
oh, still?
I doubt it.
Oh,
Oh. Right,
oh,
yeah.
shoot, I didn't see it.
I didn't even have my
Oh, with
computer
Ryan
in
up, you
front of
couldn't See
me.
that part of the screen. You know what I mean? When Ryan was. looking,
Yeah,
You couldn't see that. part.
And I was like, I will not be distracted by my cell phone during this meeting, so I'll put it face down. Sorry, Jeff.
Sorry, Jeff.
I have a conflict that just came up for the June 9th tri-P.
I can't make the June 16th board meeting.
You're both out of here.
It's it always falls, that always picks up for our annual Lake Erie fishing trip. I'm like, I've missed that twice now, that's
Are we doing policies at that meeting or are we just doing like personnel?
No, you go.
The review for-
That was an email I had in my head to send to you and ask.
Let's talk.
I may be able to do it. It depends on when my client shows up. We're saying 12:30.
There's
that day,
Jeff.
But I could maybe zoom in for the beginning, if not all, we'll see. I don't want to completely say no, but
Do we have anybody else who said they couldn't make it? You know what, Ryan? we'll look into that.
okay.